The conspirators now began to get the wind up. A senior official wrote,
"This is really all fairly unsatisfactory. We propose to certify up to 240 islanders, more or less fraudulently, as belonging somewhere else. This all seems difficult to reconcile with the sacred trust of the United Nations Charter."
The sacred trust he refers to obliges Britain to safeguard the human rights of its citizens in a dependent territory. His warning counted for little. One official offered a way round the problem. He wrote,
"We do not regard the United Kingdom as bound by such a rule. In this respect, we are able to make up the rules as we go along, and treat the inhabitants of BIOT as not belonging to it in any sense."
This same official summed up the whole charade in the subtitle of one of his reports, "Maintaining the Fiction."
Do you think they were aware of what they were doing to the people, that the trauma that was about to descend on the Chagosians?
These boys in the colonial office, did they really care very much about... Come on. No, you know, you had your standard of living, you kept to it. Your pink gin at lunchtime, and you
So they were just the natives?
The natives, yes. Unfortunately.
The cover-up went right to the top of government. It was drawn up by the Foreign Secretary, Michael Stewart, in the form of a secret minute sent to the Prime Minister on July the 25th, 1968. In this document, Stewart reveals that he is fully aware that Diego Garcia has a population going back at least 2 generations. He proposes that the government lie to the world that there is no indigenous population. On April the 26th, 1969, Wilson's private secretary wrote to Stewart saying that the Prime Minister approved the plan.
The documents show that it was decided at the highest level by the Prime Minister, most particularly Harold Wilson. He knew very well that there was a population and they were going to be removed. The problem is that this is policy made almost on the back of an envelope. There's no democratic input. Nobody was asking questions, nobody was knocking on the door, nobody was there to represent the interest of the islanders. They just didn't exist as a political factor to take into account.
Dennis Healy was Defence Secretary in the same government. When we asked Mr. Healy for an interview, he replied, "I fear I have no memories of the Chagos Archipelago. Sorry."
Lord Healy's a letter about not remembering the Chagos Archipelago.
Bollocks. Absolutely. He's an acute and intelligent man.
On May the 6th, 1969, Healy's private secretary wrote this letter to 10 Downing Street. It confirmed that the Defence Secretary had read Stewart's plan and agrees with its recommendations. In Washington, a parallel conspiracy was taking place, also in high secrecy. The object was to keep the expulsion of the islanders from Congress. So payment for the lease of the islands was disguised as a $14 million discount on a Polaris nuclear missile about to be supplied to the Royal Navy.
Is there ever a time when people in power consider the consequences of the imposition of that power? Because the consequences for the population of Diego Garcia were disastrous.
The circumstances involved how many?
2,000 people.
2,000 people.
Who'd been living there since the end of the 18th century.
Well, a fair number of them, if I remember, were external laborers who
Well,
had been brought in.
that's been shown to be untrue. The British government tried to represent them as that. They were an indigenous three, four generations.
As I said, I went through this record some years ago, and at that time, it was said that these were imported laborers to some degree.
We found in the National Archives in Washington this letter from the American ambassador in Mauritius. February the 1st, 1972, Ambassador Brewer to Washington. It is, of course, absurd to imply that Diego Garcia had no fixed population. There is no question that the island has been inhabited since the 18th century.
I don't think there's any doubt at all that the Americans who visited the islands to reconnoiter as to whether this was a suitable base area, they saw that there was a functioning civilization on the island.
They could not have been unaware of the settled human communities that they found.
So when Schlesinger said they didn't know, they'd looked into it, that just...
No, amnesia, at best. That's all you can say to that. It was not true. They knew.
There's another...
And they collaborated together on how do we get rid of these people? How do we lie that they're simply contract laborers? When many of them, their fathers, their grandfathers, perhaps even further back, were in the cemetery.
If you take a decision in Washington and London and it devastates the lives of several thousand people on the other side of the world, isn't that something that should be called to account, no matter how long?
Amongst the various activities of the British and the American government in the 20th century, not to mention the 19th century, this was a relatively small matter. If one goes back to British behavior, for example, in World War II, the attack on Dresden, the attack on the French fleet, all under Winston Churchill, whom we so much admire, and rightly so. This is a very small matter. It is being pinpointed now for reasons that I cannot ascribe to anything other than the quest for a certain publicity.
Well, I think it's from their point of view, for one thing, the Chagosian Islanders are not the Nazis, and from their point of view, it's a quest for justice.
And what is your motivation, if I may inquire? Purely the quest for justice, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yes, of
Yes,
course.
it is. Yes. Do you not think these questions are valid in asking you about consequences of the imposition of great power on peoples?
I think that the questions are based upon a refusal to acknowledge the context of the times and the attitudes of the times, and that is based upon a willingness 35 or 40 years after a set of events to go back and critique them when they had become, what shall I say, far less relevant.
Far less relevant? The High Court in London found it extremely relevant. In November 2000, it agreed with the people of the Chagos and handed down a shaming rebuke to the British government. The court ruled that the expulsion of the islanders was illegal. After more than 30 years, they had won and were finally